Evolutionary Christianity is not the same thing as biblical Christianity. It embraces and includes, yet also transcends biblical Christianity. As we understand the core concepts of our tradition, the core truths of our tradition, their own insights will be larger than we supposed. In the 1960s, people were saying God is dead. I'm here to tell you, not only is God more alive than ever, we will see all the religions move from their kind of crusty fundamentalisms, in some cases, into a thriving, a true revival, a true revival. Thomas Berry says it this way. He says, we're not going to enter the ecozoic era. His way of describing this, the ecozoic era is this mutually enhancing human-earth relationship. We're not going to get there on the resources of the existing religious traditions. And we're not going to get there without them. Until we redesign these social structures such that the cheaper, easier, convenient thing to do is the right thing to do. Such that it's in my self-interest to serve the commons. And it's in your self-interest to serve the commons. And you know something? If we don't serve the commons, we got to pay something for it. In some way. It's going to cost us something. Until we've redesigned things such that way, then our social structures will not be promoting the kingdom of God. That is, we're not mimicking machines, we're now mimicking biology in our redesign of everything that we do. And that we do so from a sacred sense, like this is what God's doing. This is ushering in the kingdom of God. And this is what the second coming of Christ is about. Not simply kicking back and waiting for some celestial, heavenly, otherworldly thing to happen, but this is something we get to, by God's grace, participate in. Connie and I, we say that we don't really care if evolution is taught in schools meaninglessly. We think it's far more important that evolution be taught in churches meaningfully. We wish every church would teach evolution in a God-glorifying way. If each of these is first-tier thinking is marked by I'm right and you're wrong, or we're right and they're wrong, or if everybody just believed like us, the world would be an okay place. Second-tier consciousness says, A, that's not even possible, and B, it's not even desirable. Symbiotic, that is mutually enhancing, where the natural world benefits from our presence as we are benefited by the natural world, and where our technology helps us to live in a harmonious relationship with the natural world. This is our destiny. Now, is it guaranteed? No. Is it possible that we could destroy ourselves? Absolutely. But again, God is for us. The universe is for us. That these patterns, these long-term patterns are on our side. It's like the whole community of life is rooting for us. I believe conservatives need liberals and liberals need conservatives. See, at this level, conservatives and liberals are fighting each other. And yet, to have a healthy body, we need both. That is, we need the conserving. Those people who have a deep and passionate commitment to ensuring that that which has been life-giving and grounding and secure and sacred in the past is retained. That's the conservative impulse. That's a good impulse. The earth needs that. The body of life needs that. And yet the impulse to transcend what is in order to have that which will be emerge is also necessary. And both need each other. I'm Michael Dowd, as you probably know by now. Connie Barlow and I travel all over North America. We've lived on the road permanently for 2 years, almost 2.5 years. And what we do is we go to colleges, universities, community colleges, high schools. Every Sunday we're preaching in some church, delivering the homily or sermon at some church, Protestant and Catholic. We do programs also at Buddhist meditation centers, at Quaker meeting houses. We go to a pretty broad range of religious and educational settings. And everywhere we go, what we do is we speak on the universe story, that is the 14 billion year story of the universe, and we do it in a sacred way. We do it in a God-glorifying way. That is, we help people understand how science can enrich and strengthen their faith. And I'm not talking about faith as some kind of otherworldly beliefs. I'm talking about how you live your life. I'm talking about how you live with your family and how you live with your neighbors and your friends, and basically how you can have like real joy in your life because you know you're making a difference in the world and being connected to God in the process. So a lot of people don't know that science can actually strengthen and enrich and deepen their faith. And here's the bottom line for me. I mean, why Connie and I have committed our lives to living on the road, I mean, this is a pretty radical thing to do. I mean, you know, to live your life traveling all around. Like, why on earth would we be so silly to do that? Why we do that is that what we're committed to is what our mentor, Thomas Berry, calls the great work. You could say every culture has its great work to do. It's kind of the collective calling of that time. My way of describing the great work of our time, our way of describing the great work of our time, is it's the work of ensuring a just, healthy, beautiful, and sustainably life-giving world for future generations of all species, and to furthering what God's been up to for 14 billion years. In other words, how do we work for a just, healthy, beautiful, and sustainably life-giving world and do so to the glory of God? And in doing so, we're furthering what God's been doing, like this creativity that God has been about for 14 billion years. How do we further that? When the Bible was written, people all over the world believed the world was flat, stationary, it wasn't going anywhere. There was the dome heavens, the sun and the stars revolved around us. Time only went back a few thousand years, and space only went up a few hundred miles. And so, into that world, people believed the world was flat, and people didn't know about each other. We didn't understand a globe. We didn't understand. The world was your region. And so, the language that people began using to describe ultimate reality reflected the plants and the animals and the terrain and the climate of their region. For example, if we over here had never experienced the political reality of a king, we wouldn't tell stories about the kingdom of God, because it'd be a foreign concept. If we over here had never experienced sheep, the Lamb of God would not be a part of our tradition. We'd still tell stories of lotus blossoms or whatever was a part of our experience. So people all over the world use the different plants and animals and the terrain because that's where their words came from. So their stories about where things came from, why things are like they are, where things are going, and why we're special as a people, obviously were different based on their different metaphors, because all we have to speak about ultimate reality are metaphors or analogies. There's no way we can describe what ultimacy is like and be literally accurate. That's one of the reasons why the Bible is full of metaphor and analogy in terms of trying to describe God. God is the rock of our salvation, or King of Kings, Lord of Lords, the Lamb of God. All these are all analogies based on people's experience about what ultimate reality is like. In fact, earlier cultures, I mean, if we go back even before, long before the Bible was written, I mean, thousands of years ago, earlier cultures related to reality. The first cultures, the first time humans used human-made or human-like analogies to describe ultimacy were in horticultural societies, that is where people are digging in the ground with a stick before plows. And we see, according to anthropological research, 93% of horticultural societies have feminine images of what ultimate reality is like. They use language like the goddess or the earth mother. And so for thousands of years, the primary analogies for ultimacy were the goddess. Now this does not mean a goddess. People who believe that way, or even people who believe that way today, don't believe that there's literally a goddess outside the universe somewhere. It's that nature is feminine-like. Some shows up nurturing and abundant and generous and sometimes severe or what have you. Well, then we see about 5,000 years ago, again, this is long before Moses was born, long before any part of the Old Testament was written. About 5,000 years ago, we see two technologies come into existence. One of them is writing, which promotes a sequential, abstract, linear way of thinking. It promotes what some would even say a patriarchal way of thinking. In fact, there's a book, it was a bestseller for a couple of years, called The Alphabet versus the Goddess, that deals just with this topic. It's written by Leonard Shlain, who's a brain surgeon, who talks about how writing promotes a left brain way of thinking. more patriarchal way of thinking. And according to his research, when writing comes into a culture, especially also when the plow, see plows, which use oxen or horses, plows take male strength. So we start seeing men stepping in and becoming the primary food providers, roughly at the same time that writing comes in. And when writing and the plow come into existence, we start seeing all the major metaphors for ultimate reality shift from feminine to masculine. Now we start seeing reality described as father, lord, king, warrior, these strong dominant male images. And again, it's not a big daddy in the sky. It's nothing so trivial as that. It's not a supreme landlord residing off the planet and outside the universe. It's reality as father-like. Not just the reality you could see and touch, but the reality that's beyond anything you can imagine. There's the transcendent as well as the immanent. God was never reduced to simply the material world. This isn't pantheism. This is the whole of reality, measurable and non-measurable. And so about 500 years ago, we start seeing a new analogy, a new metaphor. And it's the analogy of a clock. Actually not a wristwatch, but a pendulum clock. And we start seeing the analogy that now reality is not mother or father. Those are quaint. Reality is like a complex clock. And the more that we break it down into its component parts, we then understand the whole. It's called reductionism in science. The whole of reality is reducible to the sum of its parts. In the way that this watch is. If I know all about the parts of this watch, or the organ, or a TV, or a computer, or anything that's human-made, any human-made artifact, if I know all about the parts of it and how they function, I do understand the whole of it. Human-made artifacts, the whole is nothing but the sum of its parts. However, in the natural world, living systems, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. A whole molecule of water is more than the sum of the hydrogen and oxygen that make it up. There's a wholeness to each level. So, over the last few hundred years, chemists, biologists, physicists, astrophysicists, anthropologists, geologists, all the different scientific disciplines have gone down their path thinking that reality was like a complex clock, and what they discovered is that it didn't show up clock-like. It shows up creative. Nature shows up creative at nested levels. That's why I've got the nesting dolls. Is that subatomic particles within atoms, within molecules, within cells, within organisms, within planets, within galaxies. But see, here I've got these separated out. In reality, they're all nested within one another. Subatomic particles are within molecules, within atoms, within molecules, within cells, within organisms. So that all the way up and all the way down, every level is creative. Probably the most important thing I'm going to say tonight. Nested creativity and nested intelligence. That is, there's an intelligence or a creativity that every level have. Stars create the very atoms of our bodies. We now know how God created all the atoms. And to know it isn't to trivialize God. It doesn't lessen things. God is not merely a God of the gaps, like wherever the gaps are in our knowledge. Oh, there's what God must be. No, that fails to truly honor God's creativity. Creativity pervades the entire process. In fact, if you imagine the whole universe as a complex mechanism, where's the only place that God can be? Think about it. If the universe is a complex one of these, where is the only place that it's possible for God to be with respect to a mechanistic cosmos? Outside of it. Because all mechanisms, all things that humans make, the creativity that brought this watch into existence is outside of it. The creativity that brought that organ is outside of it. In other words, everything that's human-made, the creativity that made it's outside of it. So if you think that reality is like a complex clock, God can only be outside of it. So transcendence is there, yeah, but immanence and omnipresence are lost. In a mechanistic universe, you cannot close your eyes and picture or imagine immanence or omnipresence. It's impossible. So we can talk about it theologically, but we can't experience it. We can't imagine how it could be so. So we just mouth the words. But in an understanding of this nested creativity, God becomes that reality that embraces and includes all other realities, yet transcends all other realities. Then as God is wholly transcendent, beyond and more than anything we can know, think, imagine, or experience. In other words, imagine all of these dolls are within this doll. Okay, so this includes them all, but this is not part of any other larger whole. That is, this is not a subset of any larger whole. In fact, if you could see, here's what this analogy breaks down, because this has limits. In fact, imagine this last doll is now infinite in all directions, so that the entire universe is held within the heart of God. In fact, the way I imagine it is, 14 billion years ago, God planted the entire universe, smaller than a mustard seed, at the center of God's own heart, and it's been expanding there ever since. I mean, nothing can exist outside the heart of God, can it? I mean, I don't know how. If we imagine the universe is outside of God, then God is not omnipresent and God is not immanent. So God becomes a sacred name for that ultimate reality, that ultimate creativity, that ultimate intelligence, that ultimate grace that includes all of the realities, yet transcends all of the realities. So everything is held within the heart of God from this evolutionary perspective. And it's transforming over time. That is, the universe isn't just a static thing like a chair that just sits there, but it's evolving, it's expanding. The galaxies don't just look like they're expanding, they are expanding. They're all moving, the clusters of galaxies are moving away. And here's the really interesting thing. Things are transforming in a direction. God is clearly up to something. Let me introduce another one of my charts here. There's a philosopher by the name of Ken Wilber who helps people see, he has what he calls an integral philosophy. That is, he tries to hold in a comprehensive understanding as wide a collection of wisdom as possible. And what Ken Wilber, and he uses this idea of these nesting dolls, these holons, that everything is a whole part. Everything's both a whole, and it's also a part of larger wholes. Okay? So if everything is a holon, everything's a whole part, all holons, all whole parts have four aspects. They have their individual interior aspect. This is the realm of self, soul, consciousness, spirit. Okay, this is the non-measurable, intentional, subjective. Okay? And this isn't just true of humans, this is true of all things. But everything also has its interior individual, but everything also has its exterior individual, the measurable, visible. This is brain and organism, the hardware, the language, which is the software. This is behavioral. Objective. So here's the objective and subjective at the individual level. And this is measurable. This is the hard sciences deal with this realm. Okay? But nothing exists by itself. Everything exists in community, or at least as a part of a species. Yeah, I'll get that, thanks. And so everything has its collective interior. So this is the realm in the human, and this is the realm of culture, intersubjective. It has to do with worldview, morals, ethics, values. See, these things aren't measurable. I mean, how do you measure compassion? How do you measure love? How do you measure morality? This is the non-measurable, but it's real. This is the inner collective. Okay? But then there's the exterior collective, the measurable collective. Okay, so this is the social systems, the environment, this is the interobjective. And everything has all four aspects. It's not like there's just one. And as time goes on and things become more complex, and complexity happens as time goes on, things become more complex in all four quadrants. Science values this half. Science values the exterior, visible, measurable aspects of existence. But these sides are also real. This is also totally real. And for example, anthropology tends to deal with this section here. The social sciences here, the hard sciences, biological, chemistry, the physics, psychology, religion, philosophy, of course, deals with the whole thing. But to equate reality only with day language, only with this side, because of course night language deals with this side, to have a whole picture, we have to integrate it all. If you'll notice, I've got colors on the chart over here. I've got green for the living world here, and then when we get into the human realm, I've got beige, purple, red, blue, green, orange, green, yellow, and turquoise, which also match the colors of my nesting dolls. So I'm going to flip this around, and it's going to match the colors. So I'm basically going to take the same 4-quadrant model, and as things complexify, you'll see they'll go by the same colors here. So this is integrating the 4-quadrant model with a model known as spiral dynamics, which goes beige, notice the colors, beige, purple, red, blue, orange, green, and yellow and turquoise. And beige through green is called first tier consciousness in this model, and then yellow and turquoise are second tier consciousness. Now let me say a little bit about this model as a whole. Spiral dynamics is a model of human development, human evolution, that is based on over 50,000, based on over 50,000 interviews on 6 continents over about 30 years by Clare Graves and his associates. What Clare Graves was trying to get at was why it is that we human beings differ in terms of what's most important to us. Like, what matters most? Why do human beings differ on those questions? And what they were able to discern over a period of a couple of decades is that we tend to, when we're born, and then as we grow up, as we mature, we go through a fairly predictable or fairly natural sequence of worldview shifts, paradigm shifts. That is, when we're an infant, for example, our whole world is us. In fact, there's not really a distinction between us and our world. And at about 6 months or so, we bite our finger and we feel pain, and we bite our blanket and we don't feel pain, and we begin to have a distinction between me and my world. And then we continue to mature or evolve or grow up or whatever, develop, however you want to talk about it. And so beige is the color that's used in the spiral dynamic. Well, first of all, let me say something about the white. I've got white as the largest nesting doll, and again, what I mean by this is not white Caucasian, but white, pure white, the white that includes all other colors. And I've also got the smallest nesting doll is white. So this is designed to represent the mystery, the within and beyond. Okay? So spiral dynamics as a model doesn't deal with white at either level. Okay? It deals with these other colors. So beige is, as an infant, okay, when we're talking about here, the individual self, okay, and then here's our collective. So both of these are complex. So in terms of the individual beige, our worldview is pretty much the same as all other animals. Our worldview is, I mean, we're concerned about survival. You know, that's basically it. And collectively, it's the same thing. Our concern is for food, water, shelter, warmth, loving relationships, what it is to survive. Our concern is basically the same as all other animals. In fact, what I've got here is the complexity. Now, see here where I've got family and clans, that's related to this level of complexity, because down here is the social, this is the measurable, collective. Okay, so what I've got in the middle there is representative of the collective here. Okay, so the level of complexity that we're dealing with in terms of socially is family and clans, because that's the only level of complexity that we can deal with prior to language. Language actually helps us deal with a much more complex world. It's a pre-verbal culture. Information is transmitted non-verbally through gestures, sounds, imitation, feelings. We notice something and we remember it. And then we don't know if it's kind of a chicken and egg sort of thing. We don't know which one drives the other or they both spontaneously emerge. But we start seeing, with population now, we start seeing ethnic tribes, and it's quite possible that the complexity started reaching such a degree that there was chaos because you couldn't thrive in that society without some way of dealing with the complexity. And language, it's possible that language emerges out of that chaos. In any case, we start seeing simple language, and we start seeing at the level of purple ethnic tribes, multi-generational stories. Culture begins to surpass genes. Now information is not just transmitted genetically, but it's also transmitted through stories, through rituals, through rites of passage. Okay? As an infant, Purple is a child that has learned language and lives in this powerful world of energies and forces and magic and, you know, scary monsters and all this kind of thing that need to be mediated by mom and dad. Mother and father mediate this big, powerful, scary world for the infant. And in the same way, we find in ethnic cultures, in tribal cultures, we find the shaman, the medicine man, the medicine woman mediates this big, you know, world of mystery and the spirits and the forces of nature and the world of the tribe. We see symbolic language. Beliefs come into existence here. Prior to verbal speech, you really don't have beliefs. Animals really don't believe anything. They know or they don't know. They feel, they remember, they have a wide range of feelings actually. They make decisions, choices, but you wouldn't really say that they believe anything. Beliefs come into existence with language, with symbolic language. That's an important point that I want to actually stress right now, because so oftentimes people confuse faith with beliefs. And faith and trust are synonyms. Faith and trust are the same thing. Faith and beliefs are almost opposites. That is, faith is, I mean, it's what people at this level have and all of these have. In other words, faith is simply accepting what's so and making the best of it and not making it mean anything. Okay? Faith is our animal condition. It's our birthright as animals. Beliefs are attachments of the mind to reality being a particular way. So beliefs can become rather dogmatic. We can become attached to our particular beliefs. So the sense of self at Purple is a magical self. It's a very spiritual magical of self. But there's not a separated sense of the isolated ego, the isolated self. The self is still a part of the tribe. In fact, to ostracize somebody is one of the worst things you can do in a tribal culture. So red, we find at the worldview of red, and again, I want to stress this. This is just a model. This isn't the truth. It's just a model, and ultimately time will tell whether this is helpful or not helpful, useful or not useful, inspiring or not inspiring. But I'm sharing it because I find it inspiring and helpful. Red is the level of complexity where we find in the infant it's the terrible twos. It's no, mine. You know, it's possessive, it's dominating, it's the sense of self, that I'm a separate self. And it's also about domination. We start seeing, for example, did any of you read the book or see the movie Lord of the Flies?
Oh, gosh.
You know, an airplane goes into the ocean and the only ones that survive are pre-adolescent and adolescent boys. And it quickly degenerates to red. All these power kind of games and stuff. We also see big men societies. Again, population is in part what drives some of this. Population now, where you start seeing ethnic tribes bumping up against each other and allegiances and alliances being formed. And so we start seeing big men societies. That is, you know, larger societies ruled by a strong, dominant man. Warlords and chiefdoms, kingdoms. Tallies and tokens and impressions. We start seeing the ability to count and measure quantity. We also see wealth beginning to amass, because in ethnic tribes people are hunter-gatherers. They're all living all over. So you can't exactly amass wealth. But when you start settling down now into rich, fertile valleys, you can start accumulating stuff and you can amass wealth. So warfare as a chronic condition of humanity begins to emerge in red. The barter society. What this also is, though, is a level of interdependence, a level of social cooperation at a larger scale. With writing and mathematics, only about 5,000 years ago do writing and mathematics emerge. And writing and mathematics are in large part responsible for driving blue. Blue is about a mythic order. It's authority. It's a strong sense of meaning and purpose and duty. It's sacrificing now for later reward. It's ultimately saying there's an ultimate authority to which we are responsible, to which we are accountable. All the religions of the world have their grounding in blue. Blue is needed to keep red in check. Red will dominate and destroy if it's not for blue. Okay? And blue tends to be, see, in purple, you've got the level of complexity that really focuses on the tribe, not the individual. Red focuses on the individual. Blue comes back to focusing on the collective. So what we see as in these emerging worldviews, we see this kind of pendulum swing from self-sacrifice to self-expression, to self-sacrifice to self-expression, or group focus and individual focus, this sort of thing. So with blue, we see again the community of the faithful, the saved, the in community. We see theocracies in early nations. Again, in terms of the social complexity, we see theocracies, ancient nations. We also begin to see cultures of the book, cultures of the sacred text. It's not a coincidence that the Hebrew people, one of the first literate cultures, are also one of the first cultures of the sacred text, the sacred book. Because now information, like the important information for how to thrive, is not simply genetically transmitted. It's not simply storytelling and rituals and rite of passage. It's in the book. And this is really important to understand the evolution of consciousness. Because of our time in blue and our sense that God's guidance comes primarily through words, we've become what I call wordists. You know, you've got sexists, racists, or wordists. Wordists are those who believe that the primary communication from the sacred, from the divine, is through words. Well, when you look at the whole history of life, you realize, how did God, that is, how did the whole, guide prokaryotic cells to create eukaryotic cells? How did these cells begin to cooperate? Is it because they were guided by words? No, of course not. God's primary means of communication has been throughout the whole history of life, is feelings, circumstances, and relationships. That's how God's primary guidance is. And so, recognizing that, how are we guided in terms of being of service, to be a blessing? How are we guided? And it's through community and through our feelings, circumstances, and relationships. So, for example, there's a sermon. There's a sermon that I sometimes do in Unitarian churches called "Can the Universe Be Trusted?" And when I do that program, one of the things that I talk about is that trusting the universe doesn't mean kicking back and not doing anything. Because some people get the mistaken idea that, oh, I'm just trusting the universe. I don't need to be an activist. I don't need to work for peace or justice or sustainability, or I don't need to help out anywhere. I'm just trusting the universe. Well, no. Because trusting the universe is not just accepting things on the outside, that's one piece of it. But it's trusting your feelings to be a guide to how you can be in action. And your anger, your frustration, your depression, your despair, and especially your compassion. Your compassion is where your heart hurts for what's happening in the world, is your guide toward you to be in service. So if you're not trusting that to be in action, then you're not trusting the universe, because we are the universe becoming conscious of itself. We are each an expression of the universe. We are not separate beings on earth in the universe. We're a mode of being of earth. We're an expression of the universe. So trusting the universe is those. So to answer your question is that the suffering that's going on now, people that are really suffering, and unjust situations, chances are, if you're aware of that, you're going to be motivated to be in action, or in denial. I mean, some people just go in denial. But I'm assuming that in a crowd like this, we're not talking about denial. And so, it's not that we're not talking about it, but most of us feel that. And so your feelings, as you become aware of unjust situations, or it may not even be unjust, it may just be you're aware of somebody who's suffering. And you know in your belly that you can make a difference. It might cost you something, it might be inconvenient, but you know that you can make a difference. That's God's guidance of how to be of service, how to be a blessing. Orange is driven in part by, again, a technological and communications. We start now seeing the printing press. Not only do you have sacred texts, but texts that can be mass-produced. Paperbacks, pamphlets, tracts, newspapers. Ideas can be affected much more rapidly. We see the printing press, industrial revolution, and mechanistic science all tend to drive this orange level of complexity and orange level of interdependence. We see corporate states, global markets, multinational corporations, multinational organizations. A rational order begins to replace the mythic order. I say replace, and that's probably not actually the best term, because the mythic order is still there. But we start seeing now an importance of the rational. This is the Enlightenment in the West. A secular resourceism. The reality now, nature now, is no longer treated as mother or father. It's treated as a resource for us to use for human benefit. And in fact, the more we take from Earth and make things out of it and advertise it and sell it and use it and goes to the waste heap, the more that happens, the faster that happens, we call that what? Progress, right? Things are progressing, things are getting better and better. Now, obviously, that orange mindset is not sustainable. Nonetheless, when the world is treated as a resource to be used, that's the way orange sees it. Okay? And it is a level of complexity and interdependence at a larger scale. For good or ill. In many cases, for ill. Okay? Now, green is where most of the liberal traditions, the liberal religious traditions, have their grounding in green. Green is egalitarian, it's pluralistic, it's multicultural, it values diversity, it begins to see that that other species are important for our survival. The circles of care and compassion, concern and commitment have now widened even beyond the human community. We see in green activists defending the whales, defending the dolphins, defending other species. Chaos and complexity sciences are part of what drives green, as does electronics, computing, radio, television. We see, as we talked about at the break, images coming back. See, images are here, and then blue downplays images. It's about text, it's about writing, it's about sequential thinking. But images begin to come back in green. And we also see complexity, social democracies. The United Nations is grounded in green. That's the end of first-tier thinking. First-tier consciousness goes, beige really isn't included because we no longer have pre-language humans. So, I mean, where we find beige in our culture would be severely mentally retarded people, some homeless people, infants prior to language, and that sort of thing. It's not really found much. But we find purple, red, blue, orange, and green all over the world. And different cultures have different centers of gravity. Now, there's individuals, of course, at all these levels. But first-tier consciousness goes as far as green. Second-tier thinking is whole systems. It values the whole. Not just the whole spiral out, but whole through time. Second-tier consciousness takes in all of time and all of space. And let me describe a distinguishing characteristic of first-tier thinking. I'm right and you're wrong. Or, we're right and they're wrong. In other words, for each of these is certain that they're right and the others are wrong. In fact, we liberals, we do it too. One of the things I can count on whenever I speak in liberal religious settings is that we liberals tend to be very tolerant of everybody where we are and those further to the left of us. Right? But we're not really tolerant of the fundamentalists. In fact, I had this 80-year-old woman at a Unitarian church. She came up to me and she said, "I'm just intolerant of those who are intolerant." You know? And really, that's where green is. Okay? I'm not making that wrong. I'm just saying that's just a distinguishing characteristic of each of these. And in the same way that blue is the only thing that can keep red in check, green is the only thing that can keep orange in check. Now let me describe second-tier consciousness, that is yellow and turquoise. And the reason there's two colors is that, as I said, these tend to swing from individual focus to group focus, individual focus to group focus. So this is the individual and the group focus of whole systems evolutionary understanding. Second-tier consciousness is marked by, if each of these is, first-tier thinking is marked by I'm right and you're wrong, or we're right and they're wrong, or if everybody just believed like us, the world would be an okay place. Second-tier consciousness says, A, that's not even possible, and B, it's not even desirable. That our differences, second-tier thinking says, our differences are not a problem to be, in fact, first-tier thinking says our differences are a problem to be solved. Second-tier thinking says our differences are a solution to our problems. That's a huge, huge difference in the way we relate to difference. Second-tier thinking, we see a decrease in fear and an increase in trust. But not just trust that things are going to go well, trust in the breakdowns, trust in the chaos, trust in the destruction. In other words, trusting that when you look at the whole life, the story of life, the whole history of life, that one of the prime catalysts, one of the major things that causes positive things to emerge is breakdown and chaos. People sometimes say, Michael, why do you sound so positive when you talk about the future? And I say, I trust our stupidity. I trust the breakdowns. I trust the chaos. I trust that we might not even have some of the major creative transformations in the next, say, 30 years if it weren't for the challenges we're going to have in the next 30 years. So second-tier consciousness, I've got words like biocracy. What I mean by that is the shift from democracy to biocracy is where we begin to see the health and the voice of the natural world included in the democratic process. See, democracy can be dangerous. If we human beings are making decisions democratically, but we're not getting accurate feedback from the natural world, and the decisions we're making aren't in the best interest of the natural world, then we can think we're going to be having human progress, but if human progress is going this and Earth's progress is going that, in other words, if we're seeing a gross national gross domestic product rising and a gross Earth product declining, then that's obviously not sustainable. And it ultimately is not going to be the best thing for the human. So a biocracy is taking the voice and the health and the well-being of the natural community into the democratic process. It's an integral picture, that is, it integrates the whole, including the challenging, negative, painful stuff. It's a big picture vision. It's a deep time perspective. And personal computers and the internet are helping to drive this kind of second-tier consciousness. I also have another term here called symbiotic humanity, and I have symbiont. That's a term that comes from Joel DeRosnay, who wrote a book called The Symbiotic Human, and it's an international bestseller. And what he's meaning by that is that we, in the same way that eukaryotic cells created multicellular organisms, which is really what made plants and animals and fungi possible. These three major families, plants, animals, and fungi, are what made them possible is multicellular. It basically is cells creating a system where self-interest could be aligned at multiple levels. And we're in a similar kind of process. It's an analogy, so it's not, it's a medal. But in a similar kind of process in that we humans, our human beings, nature, and human technology are beginning to create a life form at the scale of the planet, where we are the metabolisms and we are the energy flows of this cell, as it were, this life form at the scale of a planet. It's cooperation at a planetary scale, where we no longer are fighting and killing each other over our respective differences, but where we see that our differences are as healthy to the life of a planet as the differences in my body. I mean, how would it be if my kidney cell said to my heart cell and my heart cell said to my liver, if they were saying, hey, you dummy, you don't think like I do, you're wrong. You see how silly that would be? And my body would not function real well if my organs were arguing with each other in terms of, no, you're supposed to be doing this. No, you're supposed to be doing this. And that's just in that same way that our body needs that diversity. So too do we as a global body, the body of life at the global scale, need our different diversity.
What would that look like? That symbiont?
Symbiont is a term simply means cybernetics, biology, and ont means the whole. So it's humanity, nature, and technology. And what it looks like, we have no idea. Well, it's not that we have no idea. We can grope. We can. How does evolution happen? We were talking before. It's like evolution is kind of like a conversation. You don't really know where it's going to go. You may have an inkling. Teilhard de Chardin talked about it as a groping, a kind of some kind of a groping sense that God, that life, that evolution is moving me in this direction, but you don't really know ahead of time because it's not a pre-thought out thing. So what actually this will look like, let's say 500 years from now. What will human beings, our technology and nature as one organism look like 500 years from now?
Well,
I don't know.
What comes to my mind is the kingdom of God.
Yes.
And which Jesus was never able to describe except in terms of mustard seeds and things like that.
Metaphors.
But Jesus did attempt to teach us what it would be like or how we could live in that kingdom.
Yes. I wholeheartedly agree. Yes, Pat?
Symbiotic. The word means mutual dependence.
Mutual enhancing, right? Mutual dependence. What it means is human beings living in a mutually enhancing relationship with the natural world and with our technology. So our technology assists us in living in a mutually enhancing relationship with nature. I believe this is thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. I mean, remember before I talked about how that each generation is really responsible for reinterpreting the core truths of its own tradition in light of this, in light of the understanding of the day. Well, when I look at things like the kingdom of God, now again, Jesus and the people who lived 2,000 years ago could only use the metaphors that they were aware of. Obviously, you're not going to find Jesus using metaphors of computers, you know. So what might the kingdom of God mean for us today? Well, one of the things, for me at least, is this. In other words, it's the human species as a whole, not just Christians, but the human species embodying the values of the kingdom. That is, the values that Jesus taught on the Sermon on the Mount, for example. And not only the values that Jesus taught, but the values that he enfleshed, that he incarnated, that he lived. So it's both who he was being and what he was teaching. And for me, that just rings so much more true to the nature of the way things are, as I perceive them, than to believe that what the gospel is really about is saving a small select group of Christians from an eternal hell while, you know, everything else goes to hell. I mean, that just doesn't even make sense to me. That seems to be a trivialization of any notion of the gospel. Let me describe the difference between green activism and second-tier activism. Because, as I mentioned, green is needed to keep orange in check. Green activism is very self-righteous, it's very judgmental, and it's usually very accurate in its assessment. Okay? I'm going to pretend that I've got right here on this chair the president of Dow Chemical. Now, I don't even know the man's name, but let's just pretend that the president of Dow Chemical is here. Now, as a green activist, my approach to this person, who I'm assuming is a rich, powerful, white male, most likely, my approach is going to be very judgmental. And in fact, my approach is going to be something like, here's my way of thinking about him is, you stupid SOB, look at what you and your company are doing. Okay? Now, first of all, as a green activist, what's the likelihood that I'm ever going to get a hearing with him? Zip. Not going to happen. But if I happen to bump into him on the street somewhere, even if I'm smiling and I'm trying to be nice, my judgmental heart, he's going to pick up. And how do any of us respond when we feel judged, when we feel attacked, when we feel blamed? Defensive. I mean, Connie can give me feedback about some aspect of my life, and if I detect in her tone of voice or in her demeanor judgment, my first response, while I would like it to be, oh honey, you're absolutely right, is usually not my knee-jerk response. My first response is defensive. And then usually within a few minutes I go, okay, you know. But our initial response when we feel judged or attacked or blamed is to defend ourselves, even if we know the other person's right. Okay? Corporations do the same thing. Okay? Now, a second-tier approach, a yellow or turquoise approach, comes from a different sort of stance. It comes from the position of, if I were you, given your genes, your history, your beliefs, I'd be just like you. If I were you, given your genes, your history, and your beliefs, I'd be just like you. If I was George W. Bush, given his genes, his history, and his beliefs, I'd be just like him. If I was the president of Dow Chemical, given his genes, his history, his beliefs, I'd be just like him. So I start now having compassion for this person. I'm no less committed to getting him to change the way that his company is doing certain practices that I deem are not helpful on behalf of life. But I'm now doing so from a place of compassion. What must it be like to be the head of a multinational corporation with that much influence and power and everything else, doing the things he's doing? I mean, he can't be totally clueless. He must know at some level of his being that some of the things that his company is doing is not exactly healthy for future life. Okay? So I start now having compassion. Well, first of all, if I genuinely got compassion and I genuinely believe that this guy's doing the best he can, given what he's got to work with, I'm not attacking him. So he's not going to get defensive. The likelihood of my getting a hearing is much better, even if it's still slim. And if I ever do get a hearing, the likelihood of him taking in whatever I'm trying to say is much better. So, because my goal is to stand shoulder to shoulder, looking in a common direction, to paint a picture of where he and his company can perhaps play a heroic role on behalf of life in the next 50 to 80 years. It's just a different place from which to base one's activism. And it's where a growing number of green activists are evolving and emerging into. But the important thing is to remember, because this is the danger of introducing this model, because usually where Connie and I are introducing this model is in green contexts, okay? And people, we Greens, we want to be as evolved as we can, right? So we think, oh, well, this is where I should be, right? Drop all the shoulds. If you're dealing with a situation in the world where your gut is saying simply confront in a judgmental way, then confront in a judgmental way. In other words, trust your gut, trust your heart, trust your own sense of things. Because again, orange is kept in check by green. Yes, it's important that we evolve as individuals as God is guiding us. We need leadership at second tier. We need leadership that can communicate to all these and that begins to value the differences. But we also need to not should ourselves to be somewhere else. I sometimes have heard that the 11th commandment, thou shalt not should on thyself. Okay? Now, let me give you a couple of examples of why we all carry this inside of us. Because imagine, of course, that the beige is actually inside the purple, which is inside the red, okay? Which is inside. We all have all of this inside of us, and we don't ever lose it. It's a part of. So all of us that are in green. Oh, actually, that won't. I forgot. I've got two different sets of nesting dolls. So the blue doesn't actually fully fit in the orange in terms of my dolls. My point is that we all draw on this when the life conditions draw it out of us. For example, when I step into an Anglican or high church Catholic or even a neo-pagan kind of Native American ritual where there's smells and there's bells and there's ritual, my purple gets triggered. I'm fascinated with the magical, sacramental, sacred, sort of connection. Red is where many women in our culture are exercising now. They're growing in red. Red is, what do I want? What do I feel? What do I think? Not just what does my father want or what does my husband think or wish. It's like moving from, as many women are, simply being, Mrs. James Doherty to Samantha Doherty or whatever. I'm just using an example. But so the sense of what do I feel, what do I want, what do I desire is red, which is a very healthy thing to do. Here's a political example. Where do you suppose Afghanistan is grounded in terms of its center of gravity on this model?
Not very.
It's largely red. It's warlords, chiefdoms, kingdoms. Okay. The Taliban were originally welcomed into Afghanistan because they provided a blue solution to red's problems. However, it proved to be a very toxic blue, didn't it? So, our president, George W. Bush, who's evangelical Christian, with strong multinational allegiances, goes in with United Nations and knocks out the Taliban. But if we try to introduce green solutions in Afghanistan, red eats green for lunch. The only thing that can keep red in check is blue. And it's one of the reasons why, even in Afghanistan and even in Iraq, even if we're able to be successful, I say we, the human community, is able to be successful in that they actually elect a democratically elected government, I can assure you it's going to be a democratically elected theocracy. It's going to be some form of Islamic governance, because it's the only thing that's going to keep red in check. They're not going to jump into Jeffersonian democracy overnight. There are many other developmental models. In other words, psychological models, theories of moral development, things like that. And again, all these different models are either useful or not, and many of the developmental models are useful. What I like about this one is that the colors actually, they make it easy to talk about. I mean, to use some of the complex terminology that some of these other models use, it's difficult unless you're an academic type person. But it's easy to say, you know, red or blue or green and this sort of thing. It originates from Clare Graves, and then it was popularized most powerfully in the 1995 by Don Beck and Christopher Cohen. And the book is called Spiral Dynamics. It's a $45 hardback. We don't carry it simply because, frankly, this book here, Ken Wilber's Theory of Everything, and this little reprint, this is from What is Enlightenment magazine, and it's the best little overview of spiral dynamics. I highly recommend this reprint as just a great overview. So the two of these are just fabulous introductions to spiral dynamics. And of course, if you want more information, the book Spiral Dynamics is actually excellent, but it's just such an expensive hardback that we don't carry it. In his book, A Theory of Everything, that we have there, his first chapter is on spiral dynamics, and it's one of the best overviews of spiral dynamics that we have. In fact, there's one thing that I do want to mention that's in it that because I don't have it up here on the chart, and it's worth them. He talks about how each of these, like for example, in beige, approximately 0.1% of the adult population is at beige, and none of the power. Okay? In purple, he suggests that 10% of the population of the world is at this level, at purple, and 0.1% of the power, so almost no power in terms of global power. Red, he suggests that 20% of the population is largely in the red worldview, and 5% of the power. Blue, he suggests 40% of the population is at blue, and 30% of the power. Orange, 30% of the population, but 50% of the power. And green, 10% of the population, 15% of the power. And yellow and turquoise are just emerging. This model, however, for me, just to speak personally for me, this helps me have a more intimate personal relationship with God than I had when I believed God was simply a supreme being outside the universe. Because now where I relate to God is right now in this moment in your eyes. I'm seeing a cell in the body of God and I'm relating. That's why I'm trying to understand you, and I'm not sure I really do. But when I relate to nature, today Connie and I went for a walk at the break, where we went down to the lake. And for me, I was looking at an image of God's grandeur, God's beauty. So I'm able to have a personal relationship with God in most moments, not every moment, because sometimes I'm just lost in my thoughts. You know, I'm just present to the busyness of my life. But much more often now, am I able to be present to the miracle of God's presence in you, or in life, or in whatever, even in a rainstorm. It doesn't have to be good weather or good anything. My first wife divorced me in 1995. It was very painful for me, and yet I felt God's presence so intimately, so personally, because I knew I couldn't change it. It was real. I knew that within time I'd be able to see that it was a blessing, but I didn't know how at the moment. So for me, whenever things are good or bad or whatever, I have that sense of God's presence. Or what the Christian religion is about. I see two emphases. I see on the one hand the calling to be saved, to be transformed, to actually to recognize my sinfulness, my addictive nature, my self-centered nature, and to repent. That is, to turn from that and to align my heart and my life with God's values. Okay? And I need community support. I think it's one of the reasons why the 12-step programs have been so successful. I think the most significant religious movement of the 20th century is the 12-step movements. However, that's the personal aspect. There is also the corresponding social. In other words, how do we embody the values of the kingdom, the values that Christ embodied and taught in our social systems? Because the realm of personal transformation and salvation is this realm that then fleshes out here. But how does this realm and this realm flesh out? That is the collective. Because until we design, or I should say redesign, until we redesign our law, our politics, our economics, our education, like all the social structures of our world, until we redesign these social structures such that the cheaper, easier, convenient thing to do is the right thing to do, such that it's in my self-interest to serve the commons, and it's in your self-interest to serve the commons, and you know something? If we don't serve the commons, we got to pay something for it. In some way. It's going to cost us something. Until we've redesigned things such that way, then our social structures will not be promoting the kingdom of God. In fact, what we've got is a situation like this. Good moral people that want to live righteous, godly lives and educate their children in the best values, send their children to the best schools so that these kids can learn how to do the worst thing best. Because again, our economic structures aren't supporting. So that's why we need both. We need the social justice emphasis, the emphasis on structural. When I say peace, I don't mean peace as the absence of conflict. I mean peace as a place of trust and tranquility in the midst of sometimes chaos.
One thing you said I was really interested in, sometimes we do pay the price of not having done it right on the social level. I wonder if we're not paying that price today in terms of terrorism.
I think, I no question about it. I think I completely agree.
It's a heavy price,
yeah.
But I think we perhaps are paying that.
And it may be, again, I think that if, from the position of time, is it possible that terrorism, as it now exists, and the chaos and challenges that we will likely experience as a species, say in the next 30 to 50 years, from people living, say, 100 years from now, people living in 2104, looking back, might, from their perspective, the things that we and our children and grandchildren might say is bad news, from their perspective, those very things might be good news. Because how does any creature, any individual, or any species make major change? Sometimes we're allured. There's something that we find so fascinating, so alluring, that we're just guided by that kind of sense of allurement. But most of the time, we don't wake up some Thursday morning and decide to make radical change in our lives. Something happens, some problem, some challenge, some chaos, some destruction, something we couldn't have planned. Somebody divorces us, we lose a job, somebody dies, or something happens, and we discover that we've got cancer or whatever, and then whoom, we make major changes. And it was the bad news that catalyzed that. What could and the same is true with other species. Other individuals of other species make major change only when they're forced to, by and large. What could cause us as a species, as a human species, what could cause us as a human family to make the kinds of major changes that we need to make to truly live in a fully sustainable way? We've overpowered all the things that could force us to change, except for what? The consequences of our own actions. We are now, the very consequences of our own actions will be the major catalysts to force us into these levels of maturity. And it's very exciting, and that's actually a piece of what I'll do tonight. These two charts, the chart on my right and the chart on my left, are essentially the same chart. That is, they're talking about the same dynamic, which is how the mechanistic paradigm has come into existence and how it's being replaced by this nested creative organic paradigm. That is, and this is the same cycle, that is, the mechanistic paradigm replaced the medieval paradigm, but it didn't do so overnight. The mechanistic paradigm was introduced in 1543. There was a 150-year period of scientific and philosophical revolution, an early Enlightenment phase, very liberal time, conservative backlash, 1725 to 1740s, things were very conservative, followed by an intensive phase, things got very chaotic. Then, 1760 to 1800, the major institutions changed. Law, politics, medicine, economics, education. This is where the major heavy lifting happened. And then the dominant paradigm, the mechanistic paradigm, became the dominant paradigm for the next 200 years. However, this nested creative, I mean, I didn't invent this stuff. This nested creative understanding was introduced in 1781, and it's going through the same process, the same cycle. Patterns in nature, these patterns, have you ever heard of fractals? Like patterns that repeat at larger and different scales? This is possibly an example of that happening in human history. So what I want to do is go through some of the details. Now obviously if you're sitting back there, you're not going to be able to see the details, but all of these charts are up on the website, and they're actually in a much better form than this. They're typed out, right? And I do want to mention, our website is just thegreatstory.org, www.thegreatstory.org. Now this website, we get like 50 to 60,000 hits a month on this website, but this is an educational website for the whole gamut. I mean, from atheists to theists, to pantheists to panentheists, and Jews and rabbis and Buddhists and Quakers and Catholics and Protestants, for the whole gamut. I do have a website specifically for Christians, which is evolutionarychristianity.org. These charts are all up on the greatstory.org website. So let me just quickly walk through how the mechanistic paradigm came into existence and how it's being replaced by the organic paradigm, this nested creative paradigm. As I mentioned, the mechanistic paradigm was introduced in 1543. Nicholas Copernicus introduces this idea of a sun-centered universe and that reality is like a complex clock. He starts using the analogy of a clock to understand the nature of reality. Then there's a 150-year period, from 1550 to 1700, approximately. There's this 150-year period where the early physics experiments, Bacon, Descartes, Spinoza, Galileo, Locke, Leibniz, Newton, all the founding fathers of what's called the Enlightenment. However, Bruno was burned at the stake. As I mentioned yesterday, Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake. The church killed him because he proposed, only 400 years ago, because he proposed that stars were actually suns, like our sun, very far away, and some of them had planets going around them. Now, he was killed for that. So there was this backlash here. Concepts of parliament and democracy go stronger. The concepts of parliament and democracy had existed in Greek times, but they were revived now. And the sense that change was possible, because remember, what's the world like prior to a mechanistic worldview? What's the medieval worldview like? God put the kings and queens in place. There was this hierarchical order. In fact, the only change happened if it was decreed by the king. Because, of course, the king was led by God. And so this radical notion that change was possible and that power derived from the people? Whoa! You talk about a hot radical idea. That was a hot radical idea. It could get you killed. Right? Early Enlightenment phase, 1700 to 1725. Hard liquor is invented. Okay, up till then all you got is beer and wine. Stringed orchestras, the piano actually had been invented a little bit earlier, but the piano comes widely used, and we start seeing these liberal parties, these dances. It's a very free liberal time. The intelligentsia are thinking mechanistically. Now, we're only talking maybe 8% of the people, but it's a very liberal free time here. New ideas of freedom and equality shock the aristocratic society. There's the sense of happiness for all men. Unfortunately, you women were left out of the equation at that point, but that was the worldview. Voltaire explains Newton and the Copernican revolution. That is, we start seeing popularizers. The mechanism, however, change is a series of fads and fashions. I mean, what really changed during this period? Anything major? Not a whole lot. Okay? But the mechanistic science continues to quantify time and space. Conservative backlash, 1725 to 1740s, both in the colonies, because remember, this is before the United States, right? This is both in the colonies and in Europe, a conservative backlash, politically and religiously. A swing to the right, followed by an intensive phase. Between 1740 and 1760, things get really chaotic. The new mechanistic philosophers, that is, those who think mechanistically, are becoming enormously popular through a new medium, a new way of getting information out, which was what? Not just the printing press. What did the printing press make possible? Newspapers, tracts, paperbacks, pamphlets, inexpensive ways to get ideas out to affect people's minds. I mean, one newspaper can affect the minds of thousands of people, millions of people now. So these were radical ways of getting ideas out. New paradigm politics and economics developed. That is, people conceptualizing what can politics be like, what can education be like, what can law be like, what can medicine be like based on this paradigm, not just what the kings say. Voltaire pretty much puts the coffin nails in the old medieval paradigm, because what he does is he tells the story of the world from that perspective. He discredits the idea that God put my great-great-granddaddy in place and therefore take my word on it. And he's also one of the senior editors of the first encyclopedia ever, which all the intelligentsia in Europe read. And it discredited the old medieval the paradigm. Then we see here between 1760 and 1800, here this 40-year period is where we see the heavy lifting. This is where we see the American, French, and European democratic revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and we see really becoming the dominant paradigm for the next 200 years. This is where the huge change happened. The organic paradigm has gone through a very similar process. That is, Immanuel Kant in 1781 introduces this idea that there's an unknowable wholeness to reality that we don't have access to. In other words, we're a subset of the whole, so we don't ever have access to the wisdom and intelligence of the whole. Notice how different that is than a mechanistic thinking. If the universe is a mechanism, it's a thing, then ultimately humans may be able to get so smart that we'll know everything about it. However, this nested creative perspective is much more humbling. It says we'll never, ever, ever know everything about everything. In fact, the more we learn that we don't know. Right? I mean, our best scientist, Stephen Hawking, would be the first to agree. In fact, in his book, The Universe, he's got a book called The Universe in a Nutshell. Now think about that title for a second. The Universe in a Nutshell. What he's saying is we know so much about this thing called the universe that we can say, here it is in its essence, right? I love to tell people, look at page 187 and 203 and see what he says about dark matter and dark energy. What he says is that 96% of the universe is said to be dark matter and dark energy. And this is there's no disagreement really about this. Well over 98% of the scientists of the world would agree that roughly 23% of the universe is said to be dark matter. Roughly 73% of the universe is said to be dark energy. That leaves 4%. That means that everything we know about everything is 4%. Now, think about it. His book, The Universe in a Nutshell, sold 22 million copies in 17 languages. Talk about a marketing genius. How many people do you suppose would have bought it had he titled it, The 4% of the Universe That We Know About in a Nutshell? Right? So, in fact, I one time had this conservative gentleman ask me, he said, are you saying that God is the universe? God is more than the universe. And I say the universe is more than the universe. We don't know what the universe is. Of course God's more than the universe. So a 150-year period of scientific and philosophical revolution based on this organic paradigm, and I'm not going to go through all the scientists here, but you've got Blake redefines art as this prophetic notion of bringing into existence what's not yet. Emerson and Thoreau, the early voluntary simplicity and civil disobedience movement, early feminism and pacifism movement here. And then a whole bunch of scientists, many of them think mechanistically, but what they discover is that reality doesn't show up like a mechanism. It shows up creative at multiple levels. And Teilhard de Chardin predicts the internet. Now, Thomas Berry has said that Teilhard de Chardin is the most significant theologian, Christian theologian, since the Apostle Paul. That's an amazing claim. But in any case, whatever you think about Teilhard, Teilhard was the first one to identify that the human is part of the universe story. In fact, let me say one thing about Teilhard's thought. This sense, and actually this goes far beyond Teilhard de Chardin, this sense that human beings are not just separate creatures on Earth in a universe, but we're a mode of being of Earth. We're an expression of the universe. We are creation, evolved to the place that creation can begin to contemplate itself. The universe has gone from simple atoms to more complex atoms, to more complex atoms, to molecules, to creatures, to societies. But who are we in this process? We are the fruit of some 14 billion years of unbroken evolution beginning to become conscious of itself. We are creation becoming aware of itself, literally. We didn't come into this world, we grew out of it. In the same way that an apple grows out of an apple tree. We grow out of the dynamics of the planet. We go out of the dynamics of the universe. In fact, Brian Swim, who's a physicist, friend of ours, he says, 4 billion years ago the earth was molten rock, and now it sings opera. Earth sings opera in and through us. Creation sings through the human. In fact, here's Brian Swim's way of summing up the entire 14 billion year story in 2 sentences. Okay? A little audacious, but I think you'll like it. Remember, at the very beginning, all there were was great clouds of hydrogen gas, right? And then things have become more complex. So here's his way of summing it up. He says, you take a great cloud of hydrogen gas and you just leave it alone. And it becomes rose bushes, giraffes, and human beings. Now again, you can use scientific language, you can do God language. In fact, when the Bible speaks about God forming us from the dust of the ground, in Genesis 2:7, and breathing into us the breath of life, that's a true story. It's a traditionally sacred way of describing the exact same thing. How could Moses have possibly said it any other way? Yeah, wow. So, Teilhard predicts the internet in the 1940s. He said, Teilhard de Chardin noticed this trend. He noticed this pattern. And he said, if this is going to continue, if human beings are going to continue this process of greater cooperation and interdependence at larger and wider scale, we're going to figure out a way to share our intelligence, to share our information at the speed of electricity. This is before computers. Early Enlightenment phase. Think of the 1960s and 70s, okay? The anti-war movement, the drug culture, the Rachel Carson publishes her book Silent Spring, which is the beginning of the environmental movement. New ideas of feminism and civil rights shock the mechanistic society. Change, however, is a series of fads and fashions. I mean, what really changed in the 1960s and 70s? Not a whole lot. Okay? However, Prigogine wins the Nobel Prize in chemistry for this understanding of a self-organizing universe. Machines are not self-organized, they are assembled from the outside. The universe is self-organizing, that is, it's creative in and of itself. Now, obviously, you can say it's God organizing, but all that means is that's the reality that's... How can all levels be creative? Well, it's the creativity of the whole, the sacred, that makes that possible. So this is what's happening here. Early Enlightenment phase, conservative backlash. Think Ronald Reagan, George Bush Sr., Jimmy Swaggart, Jimmy Baker, political and religious, this swing to the right, this conservative swing, followed by an intensive phase, what we're smack in the middle of now, which in the same way that here, in the intensive phase here, conservatives often kind of held on to power. That makes sense. This period that we're in the midst of now, the new organic philosophers, this nested creative people, are becoming enormously popular through a new medium, a new way of getting information out, which is what? The internet, of course. My book, Earth Spirit, it sold... the subtitle is A Handbook for Nurturing an Ecological Christianity. My book, Earth Spirit, in 12 years sold 13,000 copies. That's not bad, you know. It's not great. It's okay. 12,000 copies. 13,000 copies in 12 years. I'm now getting 50,000 hits a month on my website. I mean, it's a whole different way of getting information out, right? The new paradigm politics and economics are developed. People reconceptualizing, how do we model what our elders have done? That is, how do we learn from our elders? How do we humble ourselves, get out of our human arrogance, and humble ourselves to learn from our elders, the bacteria? They're our most important elders. That is, they figured out twice how to create a system where my self-interest and our self-interest was the same self-interest. So how do we model that to the glory of God? A new activist generation emerging. And the great story is destabilizing the foundation, in the same way that Voltaire and the mechanistic worldview destabilized the foundations of the medieval world. This great story is destabilized. That is, the universe story told in God-glorifying ways, in Christ-edifying ways, in ways that value what the tradition's up to, which is not the same as evolution told in a mechanistic way. In fact, when I speak to fundamentalists, when I speak to groups of just like all evangelicals or conservatives, conservative Catholics as well, one of the things I say is, you're absolutely right to have rejected evolution. Conservatives should reject evolution. Because the only version of evolution that most of us have been exposed to is a chance, purposeless, mechanistic, godless, directionless process. I mean, is it a surprise that conservative Baptists, conservative Catholics, conservative Muslims, conservative Jews are not exactly climbing over each other to embrace that version of evolution? However, once we see evolution in a God-glorifying way, whoa, can things open up. And if the pattern repeats, the idea is, this is based on the work of Michael David Shacker, who's a historian. If the pattern repeats, we're likely to see, possibly as early as 2015, but maybe not until 2020 or so. And then for the next 40 years after that, so to 2055 or 2060, the kind of major changes that we saw between 1760 and 1800. That is, a global democratic revolution, an environmental revolution, and what I call a biomimicry revolution, where we mimic biology in our redesign of law, medicine, politics, economics, education. That is, we're not mimicking machines, we're now mimicking biology in our redesign of everything that we do. And that we do so from a sacred sense, like this is what God's doing. This is ushering in the kingdom. And this is what the second coming of Christ is about. Not simply kicking back and waiting for some celestial, heavenly, otherworldly thing to happen, but this is something we get to, by God's grace, participate in. And I believe we will see a worldwide religious revival. A worldwide religious revival where all the world's religious traditions come into their greatness. See, this is the thing. This evolutionary perspective allows me to be profoundly committed as a Christian, where Jesus is my Lord and my Savior, where I am committed to embodying the values and the truths of the kingdom as spoken by Jesus, and yet I also can wholeheartedly embrace where truth shows up beyond the Christian realm. Remember my talk about language before? All religions make sense given the different bioregions in which they emerge. Hinduism has all these different gods and goddesses. Now, do Hindus really believe that there are different gods and goddesses outside the universe somewhere? No. Hindus believe that nature is divine and shows up with a multiplicity of divine faces. Hinduism never, ever, ever could have emerged in Palestine, nor could Judaism have emerged in India. Totally impossible. So in this transformation that we're likely to see between 2020 and 2060, somewhere in there, we're likely to see, I believe, a worldwide religious revival. And this will be some of the most creative time. And what gives me, let me just say, this is going to be really radical, okay? We're going to move into the final component, which is what can we reasonably expect in the next 250 years? Okay? But the two things that most give me hope are the fact that we're very quickly going to be in an oil crisis, the running out of oil, and global warming are the two things that give me most hope. And so let me tell you why. With that as background, here are some of the major challenges I think we can expect in the next 250 years. Global warming. Scientists 95% of the scientists of the world agree that global warming is real, that we are a factor in that, and that over the next 250 years we're going to see rising sea levels, like over the next 50 years, but rising sea levels, more hurricanes, more intense hurricanes, more tornadoes, more intense tornadoes, droughts, flooding, and this is a very interesting one. Plants and animals needing human-assisted translocation. What that means is, for example, in North America, 17 times in the last 2 million years, the ice sheets have come down, stayed down for 20, 30,000, 40,000 years, and gone back. And then they come down again. 17 times in the last 2 million years. And every time the glaciers, the ice sheets came down, the plants and animals boogied south. And when they went back, the plants and animals boogied back. But now, because of human settlement and fences and things like this, they can't do that unless we assist them. And so they will go extinct if we don't assist. So this is plants and animals needing human-assisted translocation. This is going to be a challenge. Continuing loss of biodiversity. We are in what some scientists call the 6th great mass extinction. That is, there's only 5 times, if you look at the history of the Earth, there's only 5 times in the history of life on Earth that there have been more extinguishing of species, more species going extinct than right now. Now, many scientists think that we could see an end of this. We could see a stabilization of biodiversity within the next 50 to 70 years, maybe sooner than that even. But whenever it happens, until it happens, it's going to be a big challenge, because loss of biodiversity is a major impact. The impact of growing human population on food, water, energy, pollution, and habitats. That's going to be a challenge. Again, a growing number of scientists think that there's a very, very realistic possibility that we will see a stabilization and a beginning to decline of human population within the next 60 to 80 years. But until that happens, it's going to be a big challenge. Growing gap between the rich and the poor. Every day, not just every year, every day, there's a growing gap between the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor. Obviously, this can't be sustained. It can't go on indefinitely. What will cause it to shift? Will there be an economic snap or collapse or an evolution or transformation, revolution? We don't know. But it's going to be a challenge. Biocomputers becoming more intelligent than we are. I've already touched on this. This is going to be a challenge. And any one or a combination of wild cards. That is, here's the wild cards. Here's the things we can't predict in most cases, but we can't do anything about them either. And I believe that if any one of these happen, we will see an outpouring of human compassion like we have never, ever, ever seen. The first is a supervolcano eruption. Do you know what a supervolcano is? Okay, fasten your seatbelts. Okay, as Diana said. A supervolcano is not like Mount St. Helens. Mount St. Helens is like a normal volcano. A supervolcano, there's only about a dozen of them in the world, and they only go off about every 100 or 200,000 years. They're very infrequent. But when they go off, it's a major catastrophic event. It's like 5 to 10,000 Mount St. Helenses all at once. Now, America's supervolcano is Yellowstone. Yellowstone is not a volcano like this. It's a huge caldera. In fact, there's a lake right at the middle. The Yellowstone Lake is at the center of the caldera. Now, Yellowstone has gone off 3 times in the last 2 million years. About every 600,000 years, it looks like Yellowstone likes to go off. Now, somebody take a guess at how long it's been since Yellowstone has gone off. 640,000 years ago, actually. We're about 40,000 years overdue. Now, it could be another 20,000 years before Yellowstone goes off. But it could also be next Thursday, and let me tell you why. Yellowstone Lake is heating up. Connie and I were there a year ago this week. Yellowstone, she used to work at Yellowstone. 30 years ago, she worked there, and it's 8,000 feet elevation. It's cold year-round. You can't go swimming. You can't stay in the water for more than about 30 seconds. A year ago, we went swimming for 45 minutes in Yellowstone Lake. It was like bath water. We couldn't believe it. And she was like, this is spooky, this is really weird. So we started doing research, finding out, why is Yellowstone Lake so warm? Well, there's a bubble, there's a huge bubble underneath Yellowstone Lake of magma that's heating up Yellowstone Lake. So geologists are really paying attention to Yellowstone, especially because we're 40,000 years overdue, right? Nobody's freaking out, nobody's saying the sky is falling, nobody's saying it's imminent. In fact, many people are saying that Yellowstone could be heating up for the 30th minor eruption. There's been 29, in the last 640,000 years, there's been 29 minor eruptions, like a normal volcano. So it could be heating up for the 30th minor eruption, or it could be heating up for the big kahuna, in which case there's nothing we can do about it. I mean, it could possibly take out a half the population of the world. But so I tell people about Yellowstone, whatever your name for ultimacy is, be at peace with it. Okay? And the people in your life who you love, tell them. Make sure they know it. I was just with my kids in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Okay? I just left them 5 days ago. No kidding. My last words were, as I hugged them, hey, if Yellowstone goes, know that I love you. Methane burp is another wild card. Periodically there's been these methane burps. These huge amounts of methane have been burped up from underneath the ocean. It doesn't happen real frequently, very infrequently. But if it happens, it can raise the entire temperature of the Earth 10 degrees Fahrenheit for 1 million years. That would impact things, right? It's a wild card. Asteroid impact or extreme solar activity, wild cards. Pole shift. The magnetic poles of Earth have shifted. North, south shifts. It doesn't happen real often, but when it happens, it impacts all of life. For example, many animals use the magnetic north as their guidance for navigation, for migration. Geopolitical conflicts. In the next 250 years, what are the different wars or geopolitical conflicts that are wild cards? Who knows? Okay? Proof of extraterrestrial life or intelligence. Now, we're not even talking that, I'm not talking about we need videotapes of little green men. Undeniable proof of bacteria on Mars or Europa or anywhere else in the solar system, which many scientists think that it's quite likely that we'll find at least 3 or 4 different places in our solar system where we have bacteria. If we have undeniable proof of bacteria somewhere else in the solar system, it will force most of the religions of Earth to have to redo their theologies. It's a wild card. NBC or GNR, error or terror. That is nuclear, biological, or chemical error or terror, or genetic, nanotechnology, or robotic error or terror. Wild cards. Epidemics of flu, smallpox, drug-resistant TB. Do you know how many people died of the flu in 1918? From 1918 to 1920, 2 years. Over 50 million people died of the flu. More people died of the flu in 2 years than has died in 24 years of AIDS. It could happen again. It's a wild card. And what Ray Kurzweil, who wrote a book called The Age of Spiritual Machines, The Age of Spiritual Machines, he talks about the singularity. What he means by that is when biological intelligence is exceeded by non-biological intelligence, when living computers are more intelligent than we are, it then becomes a horizon we can't accurately predict beyond. And 2 scary scenarios of what that could be like, one of them is the Matrix trilogy, which Connie and I happen to love. I love the mythic storyline in the Matrix. But also Arnold Schwarzenegger's Terminator series is another example of kind of a scary scenario of what that could be like. So mind you, stay with me, this is the bad news, okay? I'm going to flip this chart, and we got the good news on the other side. But this is where a lot of the people in the world focus on. It's like, oh yeah, the environmentalists and stuff like this is the bad news. So here are the long-term trends and the short-term trends we can count on continuing. I mean, we can ground ourselves in these continuing. There's great confidence or trust in these continuing. The first and most important, bad news, chaos and breakdowns will continue to catalyze creativity and transformation. If there's any trend in the universe that we can bank on, that we can count on, it's this. The bad news, chaos, and breakdowns will continue to catalyze creativity and transformation. This organic, nested creativity paradigm will have long replaced the mechanistic paradigm. That's a huge thing, because what that means is we are shifting from anthropocentric law, that is human-centered law, human-centered medicine, human-centered politics, human-centered economics, human-centered education, to life-centered law, life-centered education, life-centered economics. In my lifetime, we will see an economy where we do away with waste, where waste is eliminated as a concept. Really exciting stuff. This will happen. Technology further enabling and empowering human connectedness. If you look at the history of technology, it is, especially communications technology, it has consistently enabled and empowered human connectedness, which then drives people and organizations to sharing information and experience more widely, more often, and more deeply. Our circles, this whole spiral dynamics model, our circles of care, compassion, concern, and commitment, individually and as a species, will continue to widen. Cooperation, true interdependence, like I was talking about here with Wes, where we're in it together. We win together or we lose together. This will continue to expand at multiple levels. It's a trend we can count on. Feedback, here's a really interesting one. Feedback, inner feedback, which is about why meditation practices and mindfulness practices and psychological stuff and counseling and therapy and 12-step work and all this is really valuable, important stuff because it's all about inner feedback and relational feedback, but also outer feedback, that is how we're doing with the world. We're getting more and more accurate feedback and we're starting to act on it more and more, and this is a trend that we can continue because frankly a democracy is dangerous if it's not getting the right feedback. Because you've got a democracy where, say, we in this room are making decisions that impact future generations, that impact the natural world, but if we're not getting accurate feedback for how we're doing, we may be making decisions that are really destructive. So it's one of the reasons, and this is already happening. One of the reasons why regimes today can't get away with the kind of stuff regimes could 50 years ago is because of cell phones, the internet, television, satellites, digital cameras, and CNN. Okay. And the world's religions will continue to integrate evolution and ecology. This will happen, and if you look at this last 30 years, this has happened tremendously. I used to give you a little more background, in addition to being an anti-evolutionary fundamentalist and then pastoring 3 churches over a decade, after that I worked with the religious leadership of the United States. I helped organize Jewish rabbis, Roman Catholic priests, Protestant clergy, unity ministers, on key environmental issues that were coming up for a vote in Congress. I was the religious organizer of the National Environmental Trust, the largest environmental lobby in the United States. So I helped organize the religious community. And I got a sense how rapidly this is happening, especially among the leadership. Now here's the likely good news. I'm not talking about like holding out hope against hope, crossing our fingers and kind of hoping for good news. Here's the things I think we are likely good news in the next 250 years. First of all, human population will have stabilized and then declined. Now, it's possible one of these bad news kind of big things could take out some of the population, but that's not even what I'm talking about. Even without any kind of major catastrophic event. Oh, I forgot to mention one that I just learned about the other day. Forgive me, I got to go back to the other side, but there's one thing I just found out about the other day. There is an island in the Canary Islands that are close to Africa that half the island is poised. The next earthquake could drop it into the ocean, which means it's a rock so large that it would create a tidal wave that 12 hours later would basically make Miami, New York, and Boston history. They wouldn't exist anymore. All the buildings would be torn away. It would be there would be no mind. Now, there would probably be time to evacuate most, but I mean, that's a wild card, right? My family lives in Miami, most of my family, right? So human population will have stabilized and then declined in the next 250 years. I think this could happen by the year 2060 or 2070. Clean, renewable energy sources will have long replaced toxic, non-renewable energy sources. Again, we're being forced into this. What's driving us to change is the same thing that drives all creatures to change. Sometimes change happens because a creature has initiative or curiosity. Those are real, and those do impact change. But more often than not, what drives major change in individuals, any other species, any other creature, is something happens, and you just got to do something different. But the thing is, we humans have now overpowered all the things that could make us change, except for what? The consequences of our own actions. In other words, we're creating the conditions that are going to force us to change. For example, we're running out of petroleum. That will force us into a hydrogen solar age. The 6th great mass extinction will have ended. When we speak to young people, one of the things I love to do is I just get right in their face. I say, I did this today. I spoke to a group of 12, 13, 15-year-olds today. I said, you get to be the first generation that ends a mass extinction. Kids need a heroic role. Kids need some way, a vision of some way that they can play a role in a positive way where they can contribute and make a difference. Instead of we're just giving them the sense that what's most important is to usher them into this frictionless glide into the land of plenty where shopping is what it's all about. Biomimicry. Design revolution. What that means is biomimicry, mimicking biology. It's designing law, designing medicine, designing politics, designing economics, the way biology does it. So it's not taking machines. I mean, think about education. What is our educational system modeled after? Factories. Our educational system is not modeled on the way nature does education. But it's shifting. There's tremendously exciting models all around the United States, all around the world, of education that's truly a thriving, much different model of education. We could do a whole program on that, but not tonight. Global democratic biocratic revolution. I talked about a democracy. The democracy can be dangerous if we're not getting accurate feedback. Well, a biocracy is feedback. It's the same thing as a democracy, but it's biocracy. It brings the voice of the natural world. So, for example, in a democracy, somebody might speak for the health of this watershed or for the health of these species. And the voice of these creatures or these watersheds or these bioregions are being voiced and entered into the democratic process. Their concern, again, it's self-interest. The self-interest of the bioregion, the self-interest of this forest, the self-interest of these species are heard in the community of life, in the decision-making process. And this isn't some new age, airy-fairy kind of thing. This has already begun in the United States and in many other parts of the world. The Endangered Species Act is the beginning of biocracy in the United States. All significant worldwide religious revival. I believe that we will see all the great religious traditions come into their glory, come into their greatness as a result of embracing this evolutionary and ecological understanding. I mean, in the 1960s, people were saying God is dead. I'm here to tell you, not only is God more alive than ever, we will see all the religions move from their kind of crusty fundamentalisms, in some cases, into a thriving, a true revival. All significant pollution problems will have been solved. Now, this doesn't mean all problems, because every level, again, creates its own issues. But all of the major pollution problems in the world, I believe, will be solved in the next 30 to 50 years. And nanotechnology will play a large part of that. Global self-interest, personal self-interest. Well, let me say one other thing. See, we don't get exposed to the good news. We hear all the bad news because that's what's considered newsworthy. But we don't hear all of the incredible positive examples of things that are happening around the world. We could do a whole evening just on that. Global self-interest, personal self-interest, and corporate self-interest aligned. That's what drives this. That's what drives this whole process, is the alignment. That's what will drive second-tier global consciousness, second-tier biocracy, global governance. Symbiotic, that is mutually enhancing, where the natural world benefits from our presence as we are benefited by the natural world, and where our technology helps us to live in a harmonious relationship with the natural world. This is our destiny. Now, is it guaranteed? No. Is it possible that we could destroy ourselves? Absolutely. But again, God is for us. The universe is for us. That these patterns, these long-term patterns, are on our side. It's like the whole community of life is rooting for us. Finally, what Joel de Rosnay, who wrote a book called The Symbiotic Human, actually I think it was called The Symbiotic Man, but it should have been titled The Symbiotic Human. He's a Frenchman that it was translated into English. But he calls the sybiont, which is cybernetics, biology, and ont is the whole. And what he means is this symbiotic humanity. Humanity, technology, and nature as one organism. This is the whole, more than just a global brain, but a global organism where human beings are a part of the metabolism of that. We are in that process. That is the future of this process here. And it doesn't mean we lose any individuality. We don't. It's just redesigning the system so that the cheaper, easier, convenient thing to do is the right thing to do. So that it's in our self-interest to serve the commons. And where we have good laws and good surveillance and good understanding, so people can't freeload. So there's a lot that needs to be done. I don't mean to paint an unrealistically rosy picture. But it's not difficult to redesign the system such that self-interest is aligned and so that the cheaper, easier, convenient thing to do is the right thing to do. And that is our destiny. And all we got to do is learn how it's already been done. And there's been a lot of this learning that's been happening. And I'm a short-term pessimist and a long-term optimist. When I look at the next 250 years, I'm hugely optimistic. But when I look at the next 50 years, whoa. We got some big, big challenges. But here's the thing, and I want to leave you with, I'll leave you with this thought. People living 100 years from now, assuming, of course, we don't blow ourselves off the planet, right? Or an asteroid hits or whatever, okay? But assuming that humans exist in 100 years, how will they look back on our time and of, say, the 21st century? I think they might say something like this. Remember in 2007, there was that war that broke out in 2003 around Iraq and stuff, and my gosh, what happened in 2007 that couldn't have been predicted? And remember that nuclear exchange in 2010 that forced us to say, enough! And we made changes with regards to nuclear technology that we might have never made if it had not been for that. And then 2011, that whole thing that we talked about earlier, kind of peak oil, but we realized by 2011 and 12 that we were actually on the downside, and so all the world's economies started shifting. And then from 2015 to 2045, it took that long to shift from an economics that was human-centered and oil-centered to an economics that was truly life-centered. And I'm making this stuff up, but my point is that the things that people 100 years from now, will the things that we and our grandchildren, we and our children will say is bad news, from their perspective 100 years from now, will they say it's bad news or good news? Probably good news, because it will be that. I mean, how does any creature, any organism, or any species evolve? How do you evolve? Yes, stress, right. I mean, how do you evolve? Did you ever wake up some Thursday morning and just decide, yeah, I think I'm going to make radical change in my life today, and actually did it? It's because of chaos, it's breakdown, it's stress. Yeah.
I don't know if we really answer this question or not, it's not kind of weird, but since we are making a God's body, like what would you compare, like if you were doing an analogy, like us killing each other and like, you know, the evils and stuff that happen, what would you compare that, like what's happening in God's body?
Beautiful, great question. So if we are like cells in the body of God, if we're like a part of the larger body of God, what is to compare? I actually asked that question one time in a workshop that I did, and there was a medical doctor, a guy who was an MD, and he was a surgeon, and he said, he raised his hand, he said, I'd like to share my perspective. And he said, here's his lay person's description. He said, cancer is a normal cell that becomes cut off or disconnected from its genetic memory. Cancer begins to, when it becomes disconnected from its genetic memory, it no longer has the guidance of millions of years of evolution. So it starts thinking that it's separate from the body. And cancer will then begin to consume the body of which it's a part. And of course, if cancer consumes enough of the body, it'll kill the body, but it kills itself, right? Well, he said, what do people call our society? Don't we call it a consumer society? What does to consume mean? It means to eat up. Why are we eating up the planet? Is it because we're bad, rotten, evil, crummy, sinful people? Or is it because, like the cancer cell, we thought we were separate from the earth? We didn't know that we were connected, and we had millions and billions of years of guidance. So as we come to embrace this great story, this evolutionary story, from a God-centered perspective, we then align and connect with the whole, and we can have the guidance of all this billions of years. And it's like the cancer cell being reconnected to its own deep wisdom, and so it no longer has to consume the body of which it's a part. But that's a great question. I'll actually, let me close with a quote from Thomas Berry. And it gives you a sense of where I ground my faith, my trust. It goes like this. The basic mood of the future might well be one of confidence in the continuing revelation that takes place in and through the earth. The basic mood of the future might well be one of confidence in the continuing revelation that takes place in and through the earth. If the dynamics of the universe from the beginning shaped the course of the heavens, lighted the sun, and formed the earth, dynamism brought forth the continents and the seas and the atmosphere, and awakened life in the primordial cell, and then brought into being the unnumbered variety of living beings, and then brought us into being, and guided us safely through the turbulent centuries. There is reason to believe, good reason to believe, that this same guiding process is exactly what's awakened in us our present understanding of ourselves and our relation to this stupendous process. Sensitized to such guidance from the very structure and functioning of the universe, we can have confidence in the future that awaits the human venture.